Hi, my name is Bill Brewster. I'm a British journalist, DJ, and football fan. Today is not unfortunately about football, but it is about one of the most innovative techno artists in the world. He came from the second wave of Detroit artists in the wake of Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson. Even though he's not actually from Detroit, he sort of is really. I'm sure we'll discuss that during the interview. Please welcome Richie Hawtin. Hi, welcome. Hi. So, one of the things we're interested in talking about today is futurism and technology and looking into the future. And I'm going to ask you to gaze into your crystal ball at some stage during the discussion. But one of the things I wanted to start with is about science fiction and science fiction's relationship to electronic music, because it's not something that people ever write about, but it's really deeply embedded in the culture of science fiction. And I know that when you were younger, you ran a bulletin board, a Star Trek bulletin board. So I know that you are a science fiction fan. And I'm just wondering what it is about science fiction that appeals to so many electronic music fans.
Yeah, as a kid, I was very, very much inspired by science fiction, both in books and movies. Actually, before I was going to be, well, I never actually thought I would be a DJ or a musician, but I always thought I was going to do something creative. And I was hoping to go into film and into special effects. So I was very inspired and excited by watching sci-fi movies, Star Trek, and wondering how they made the future look real and how they envisioned the future. And through that, I sat so many hours watching science fiction movies. And one of the things that you have to do if you're trying to show people the future on the screen is also make it sound like the future. And a couple of movies still are really important in my mind. Forbidden Planet, which came out, I believe, in the 50s, and then Logan's Run, which came out in 1971. And I believe one or both, one of them was actually the first movie that was completely created electronically for the soundtrack. So before I even really found Detroit techno, before I thought about DJing, I was already watching the future, but perhaps even as I was watching, I was even more fascinated in hearing the sounds of the future. And as Bill is saying, there's a lot of techno electronic music artists who are fascinated by science fiction because it's about imagination. You know, I came up through the Detroit scene through watching and listening to Derek May and Kevin and Juan Atkins and Eddie Fowlkes and Blake Baxter. And in the 70s and 80s, after the riots of Detroit, people didn't see much future in Detroit. You either worked at the automotive factory at Ford or GM, but there wasn't much more. Motown had gone. And what I took out of my feeling in Detroit at that moment and my conversations with Derek and Kevin and listening to their records was that they were so interested in the future because the present wasn't very positive or very exciting. So they looked to the future for opportunity, for a positive new world. And that positivity, that a future where anything is possible, is really instilled in my mind into the type of techno and music that I love, Detroit techno. It's about looking forward. It's about creating sounds of experiences that make you feel that you're in tomorrow. And tomorrow is exactly what science fiction is about.
It's funny you mentioned Derek May, because there's a quite evocative interview with him very early on in his career where he said when he was making music that he closed his eyes and imagined he was on a train in Germany. And this was a revelation for us white honkies in Europe, because obviously we'd imagined ourselves to look like Rick James, possibly black, possibly with jerry curls, and maybe a lap dancer quite near, and playing some funky bass. So it was amazing to hear these black guys imagining that they were kind of in this white environment. And obviously a lot of your career has been based around Europe, and I'm wondering, you do have European connections. Tell me a little bit about the kind of the push and pull between African America and white Europe.
Wow, there's so many things going on in that question. I think, first of all, Derek imagining himself being in Europe, far away on a train, on an automotive, connected to Kraftwerk. This kind of, again, it's a far place. It's, in a way, it's a future, because you can't get there today. You have to get there tomorrow. And but also that Detroit was never a destination. It was never a New York or a Chicago or London. It was just kind of an isolated place. And so I think that's also why such a futuristic imagination came out of that city, because nobody came to you, so you had to imagine going to them. And music allows people to travel without moving. You can send these frequencies out as far as they can go, and I guess they kind of go forever, and hopefully there's someone out there listening. But for me as a white kid coming from England, moving to Canada, moving to Windsor, which is just on the other side of a river from Detroit. So if you guys know London, you've got North and South London. Where I grew up, North London, this is going to be confusing. North London was Detroit, and South London was Windsor, because the way the land goes, at that point in geography, America is north of Canada. You following me? Anyway, just a little strange anomaly there. But as Derek and those guys were imagining, and I think being somehow isolated in Detroit, as a white kid coming from England at 9 years old to a completely alien place with no friends, no family, like my mom, my dad, but no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, I was also very isolated. And that kind of changed me from an extrovert, knowing everybody, to a really intense introvert. And where I found a place to start to reconnect to people, especially over large distances, was through music and technology. Like, back to your first question, I was running at 14 or 15 what was called a bulletin board system, which was pre-internet. It was my computer connected to the phone line, and one person could come in and write a message, and then another person could call in, and we communicated. And that reach out of using technology to communicate was incredibly empowering. I didn't actually need to go outside my house. I could do it from my basement. And that computer and typing code and typing and talking to people on a computer screen somehow slowly transformed into a drum machine or a computer program that made frequencies, and further allowed me to kind of send my personality further than my bedroom, as I just tried to imagine the future, being inspired by science fiction and movies, and trying to create sounds that I'd never heard before.
Okay, so now we're going to get our crystal ball out. Imagine we're 10 years down the line. And we were talking about this before we started this discussion. How do you think the life of a performer would have changed, and what will he or she be using? Where will their music come from? How different will their job be? How would you envisage what you do to be like in 10 years' time?
I think you can probably put my answer onto any craft that uses technology, because a lot of what we do as musicians using machines and devices and computers, which don't always give a direct feedback to a touch or a physical movement and a sound, like a guitar or a drum. You hit it, you see someone hitting it, you hear the sound. But sometimes doing things on even turntables or computers, there's some kind of disconnection to the creative moment and the imagination that's going from me or from the human through this machine and then coming out at the end in a sound or a painting. And so the future for me is finding a way to make that as transparent as possible, so there's a deeper understanding and appreciation for the craftsmanship and artistry of making and performing electronic music. So I would like to think about the technologies we have now. You have Facebook Live, like everybody's talking about this and how that's creating social change, but how can more live streams also create a deeper connection to what I'm doing spontaneously, through cameras, through sending out more information as I'm playing. Right now, when I DJ, every track that I play goes to my Twitter account and gets tweeted, because I don't, and this is only about me I'm talking about, I don't think it's only about the records that I play. So sharing that doesn't allow or make anybody to be able to go down the street and buy those records and try to be rich. It's just part of what makes my performance my own. So I want to give that information. I want to give as many streams and have the ability for the audience now or in the future to get as close to the artistic, creative moment as possible. And I think that's, when you're talking about man or woman and machines and electronics, when it goes beyond a direct physical drum, boom, it's quite hard and it's quite abstract. But wouldn't it be wonderful if people felt a little bit more closer to that moment?
Do you think we'll still own music in 10 years? Or I do wonder whether when you're DJing, you'll just pluck it from the cloud.
Yeah, we actually did tests already where we were streaming from the cloud into Tractor. And yeah, I think on that level, if you look back, again, this is from my perspective, you look back 10 or 15 years when I left my house, I had to decide which 100 records I would take with me. And there's an art form of that, of saying, okay, these are the tracks I want to play, I need to play. And then the digital revolution came. And now I've got 10,000 tracks or 20,000 tracks with me. Way too many tracks, totally, if I'm honest. But that allows me to kind of live in the moment more and spontaneously have a feeling for what needs to be played then. I may not find the track that I need to play because I've got too many, but I still have more creative options. And I was never good at planning anyway. If I had an exam tomorrow, I would be studying later tonight. So I feed off of spontaneity and living in the moment. What do you do on a dance floor? What do you do at a concert? You're waiting for the favorite songs in a way, you're waiting for an experience, but you're waiting for that moment, that surprise. And that's what I want to give the audience every time I play. So I also want to surprise myself. So I do very little planning. I kind of get on stage, I may prepare song one. I've done some sorting of, the newest tracks and not many old ones, because I prefer to play new tracks. And I just kind of press start. And track one goes to track two, to track three, to track four. So it's so spontaneous. It's like listening to me think, or to listening to me how I'm feeling. And tying these two things together, if I can kind of bring people closer into what's happening as I'm doing that, that's what I want to see in the future of performance. And if I can be directly connected not only to the cloud, or whatever we call it in 10 years, to all the music that's been created, that's really, really cool. But actually being connected to all the songs that have ever been created wouldn't be that inspiring for me. But if I knew I could stream and I could hear and listen into a studio to my favorite producer, because a little green light just came up and said, Ricardo Villalobos is recording something right now. Do you want to listen in? And I'm like, okay, that sounds pretty cool. That would work exactly at this moment. And I can pipe that in so that my creative moment becomes connected to another creative moment in real time. And then the people in front of me also have this spontaneous connection, moment, feeling. That's something magic and beautiful. And I think that's, as crazy as that sounds, as all this technology of streaming and doing all this, isn't it just about 2 records? I think what I love about being on the dance floor at a concert is back to that moment of epiphany, or, wow, what the just happened? What record is this? So tying all that together, streaming, grabbing, and then here it is, and then it's gone, that's beautiful.
Until the arrival of EDM several years ago, America had never really fallen in love with electronic music. It seemed to be seen either as a gay pursuit or an African-American interest. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on just why America really never took to it.
Yeah, I think America was taking to electronic music in the early 90s. There was a really large rave movement on the West Coast, some strong clubs. Actually, laws were starting to become looser. Clubs could go later, till 3 or 4 or 5. But September 11th, 9/11 in America really changed the fabric of the culture, of the nightlife, of, in a way, creativity, because it started to become, creativity is about being an individual, about doing something different, about actually standing up and saying, hey, I'm doing something different. And I think those events in America kind of stifled that. But as that was all happening, music was slowly desensitizing the US market to electronic music. If you think back to some of the big pop records, especially Madonna and stuff, you would hear 909 drum machines, and it was like the sounds that Juan Atkins or Derek or would have used in those early Transmit records. They started to come through. So I think America's just a big place. Like, to get people connected and all kind of feeling and thinking the same thing, and connecting New York to LA, and it's not like Brussels to Antwerp to Frankfurt. Like, this is huge distances. So there's so many things that were going on to kind of hold back a new art form, a new culture. Why did EDM finally take over and become popular? I think it was built on those foundations, that foundation that was very slowly built. But it also, EDM changed some key things. It brought in this kind of nearly like a short form song-based structure of drops, and there may have not been as many vocals still, but it was nearly like chorus verse. It was something that was more easily digestible to the North American market. And that's also why it's exploded. EDM is electronic dance music, so we are connected somehow. But for techno, you've got this innate energy and spirit to look forward and to innovate and to, again, look towards the future. Whereas EDM, I think, is culturally based upon creating something that is for now, for the moment. And when you're making something just for the moment, it can work incredibly right then, but can also quickly disappear. And when you're looking forward and creating something, it has the potential to perhaps become, as we call, timeless.
What interests me about EDM is not particularly how it sounds now, but I think for me it's more about the consumers of EDM, because I've met a lot of people in the UK whose eureka moment for electronic music was hardcore or The Prodigy, but both very important points, I think, in British electronic music. And I see a lot of parallels in the States with EDM. I think it's something that for 12, 13, 14-year-old kids is a very exciting thing. And maybe the product of EDM in 8 years' time, 10 years' time is perhaps what will be more interesting. I'm wondering how you think it will impact on America.
You're already seeing the change of the American market and those new participants of our global electronic scene. 5 or 6 years ago, I was doing quite a lot of bigger shows, EDC, Electric Daisy Carnival in Vegas, and really you could see the people on the dance floor, especially if they were coming from one of the bigger stages of like hearing something a little bit more poppy. They were like, "Well, what? This music's like alien music." I was like, "Yeah, well, it's kind of from the future, so I guess that's a good description." But they were like wide-eyed. They were like, "Wow, this is cool, really amazing." And now you're seeing a resurgence of underground warehouse parties in America. And of course, you've got some of the older fans, the 30-year-olds, whatever, 40-year-olds who were there in the underground parties back in the day. But what you're actually seeing now are the kids who 4 or 5 years ago went to an EDM concert, found techno or underground house music at a smaller stage, and now don't want to go to those festivals because they want to go deeper. And that's why, I guess, compared to maybe some of my other peers, that I'm quite positive about the EDM movement. I'm not going to be at home listening to most of that music. It's not my style. But when I see Skrillex or Deadmau5 opening up kids to the potential of electronic music, of technology-based creativity, something that's been produced by, kids typing on a computer or manipulating something other than a guitar and a drum, that excites me, because that's what I believe in. I believe in using technology to unlock creativity, and EDM is allowing more people, more kids, even the older generation, to finally say, okay, maybe there is something to this music, computer music.
You've worked with Anish Kapoor, and Ben, your manager, told me you just finished working on an art piece with somebody. The name escapes me right now, but you've also worked on art pieces with your brother Matthew for Art Basel, and you're obviously influenced by art as well in a lot of different ways. Is what DJs do art? And if so, why?
Yes, and to what level I think is subjective, because some people would look at an abstract painting, which is like a Ryman, or like a white canvas with a slash, and be like, that's not art, but I would consider that art. So I think music is a creative endeavor, and the very best DJ, no matter how they're playing, and by my definition, takes together at least two sources, well, even one source, but manipulates music in a way that is uniquely their own. And they put their stamp on that track or on those tracks. and make it something new and different. So some kind of creative, artistic process has happened somewhere along the way. You know, I love going to a dance floor and hearing what some of us call the third record. You know, the two come together and suddenly you're like, wow, I have one of my most beautiful moments was listening to Derek May and struggling with myself to get off the dance floor to see which of the two records was making this record, because I knew it didn't exist, or staying on the dance floor and enjoying this moment because I knew it would never come again. Luckily, I stayed on the dance floor, and it's still today absolutely incredible. But for me, I want to push that envelope as far as possible in DJing, using pre-recorded music, or in the future, music as it's being created, and putting it together in my own unique perspective. We all see things differently. Someone says an Anish Kapoor piece of art or sculpture is beautiful. Some people say it's a piece of rock. And some people listen to me DJing and say, well, he's just a DJ playing other people's tracks. So I guess the short answer, I think DJing has been an art form since the first person took a record and manipulated it in their own imagination. Just a scratch, cutting it up, 2 tracks and recreating a new edit out of 2 copies. That didn't exist before. Derek May used to play, well, still does, or Jeff Mills would play one record, and with the EQ, take things and bass out and the highs, and at one point, you didn't know what record was playing, and he was still only playing one. That didn't exist on the record. That wasn't the intention of the artist who made that record. Maybe actually the artist was like, oh my God, you're destroying my art. Just could be. But Derek was putting his own creative stamp and sending it out and taking having the, what's the word? I always forget this word. The guts, the balls to say, this is how I want this record to sound.
What was your first encounter of electronic music, and what impact did it have on you?
I don't know if I remember exactly the first encounter with electronic music, because it definitely happened very, 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 very young. I grew up in a household where my dad was an avid record collector. Later on, when I went through his records, which really took me deeper into music and electronic music, I found records from Kraftwerk, from Pink Floyd, from Tangerine Dream. And at my earliest memory, I remember my dad sitting in front of his turntable and his reel-to-reels and playing music. I remember when I was 6 or 7, going into my mom and dad's room and wondering why the back of their wall in their bedroom was painted black and had a prism and had color going through it, like the cover of Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. So that the music was a tapestry and surrounded my life from a very early age. About 5 or 10 years ago, I went I went to listen to Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd for the first time, because I'd never listened to it. And I knew every track. I didn't know every track, but I knew every track in the order. I knew the transitions. It was like sitting down with an old album that you knew intimately, but I didn't remember ever hearing it. I'm quite sure that was my dad playing that on and over again, except for the times that I remember my mom saying, turn it down or put your headphones on, which was my other image of my dad. He had these great big white 70s headphones. So quite often he was also, told to put those on.
And what was your first, how old were you when you first saw a DJ play? And who was it, and what were they doing?
Man, I have a photo of my 9th-year-old birthday party and my cake. And for my 9th birthday, it was the last birthday right before leaving to Canada. I had a disco. I had all my friends over. I was given this incredible record by my aunt called Disco Direction, and it had this amazing, it was all this disco stuff, which was kind of electronic and stuff, but it had a track by the Raj band called The Crunch.
The Ra band.
Ra band, yeah. Called The Crunch, which is, it's not 303s, but it's an instrumental. It is so techno, and that was like my favorite thing at 9 years old. And before that, why I had a disco, I was into music, I was into dancing, like at around 6 and 7, I remember having a dance, or like, I guess it was called a disco at the school, and wearing all black and thinking I was really cool and having these dance moves, which I'm glad there was no videotape from those times. But somehow I was into that. Like, it wasn't that was, at that point I knew I was going to be a DJ, I'd be involved in music. I didn't think so. I didn't feel I would be able to stand up in front of people. But it was there already, something of that fascination. And those early days of being in school and high school and going to the dance and going and you know, who are you going to dance with, which girl are you going to ask to dance to the slow song, but also being fascinated by the person who was playing the music and also by the speakers, because my dad was also interested in speakers, and they always had these pretty cheesy but flashing lights that kind of work with the music, and I loved those experiences. So it was, but I don't think at that point I was fascinated by it, but it wasn't that it was calling me. At that moment I was still, except for being on the dance floor, I was quite happy being at home by myself, talking to people on the bulletin board. I was still quite introverted, and really took me a long time as a DJ and a performer and even a talker here to become better and more comfortable with more the extrovert side of creativity and performance.
You mentioned being introvert, and my wife also moved around a lot when she was a child, and I think that made her very introverted as well, having to go to new schools. And you moved to a completely different continent at quite a crucial age in your life, and that must have had a huge impact on you as a child, to be taken from a place like Banbury, which, as we both know, is rural and quite beautiful, to a more urban environment. I'm wondering what effect the shockwaves of that were for you.
Yeah, I think that shockwave I still feel today in my pursuit of also wanting to be somehow in control of my destiny, of loving that technology allows me to make music or have a voice by myself. I don't need a band. You know, because, you know, at 9 years old, again, what I remember, I was, you know, this extrovert. I knew everyone in school, you know. At least if I'm totally honest, I think I was kind of cool and like in the middle of everybody. And when I went to Canada, not only did I go to a completely new foreign place, okay, they spoke the same language, but I had an accent, so everybody was like, oh my God, where are you from? You're so weird. And we went from a beautiful garden setting and in a village to this automotive capital of Canada, and there's all these wires overhead. That's what I first got off the plane, I remember. Because in England, most of the wires and the power and the telephone lines are all underground. But in America, everything's everywhere. It's like complete chaos and huge cars, and it was really like going to another planet. And another big change was that my mom has 11 brothers and sisters, so we had a very social structure, going to see my nan and my grandpa and my cousins, and you know, it was dozens and dozens there was people always around our house, and suddenly it was me, my brother, my mom, my dad, and that was it. We didn't know anybody, and it was really a moment where the Hawtin family became quite insular, very strong, because we had nobody else to really depend on. And I think that created a much more introverted version of myself, but also in the end made me quite strong in having my own opinion and direction and the ability and courage and strength to say, I want to do that, and I'm going to do it. How am I going to do it? Well, I'm going to figure it out. And if I need some people, I'm going to find the right people. But if I can do it myself, maybe even better. And, I have an incredible network of friends and an incredible team who help me envision everything that I'm doing now. But in those early days, the power of computers and technology to allow a funny white kid, introverted in the basement, far away from his most of his friends and family members, just the power of that was incredible. I could really felt like I could do anything. I could sit there if I gave enough time and energy, if I programmed long enough and stared at the computer screen long enough and debugged. At one moment, I could press start, and the computer would do something that nobody else could have done.
When did you start making forays into Detroit? Because I know that they're very close, but I think culturally they're quite separate. And I've read in a few interviews that you've done that many people, even though they live very close, never went to Detroit. Tell me why you did and what you found there.
Yeah, it's a well-timed question, because in a way, my family, we had no history in Canada. We had no history of Windsor or of Detroit. Okay, we kind of knew that it was the murder capital of the world in the 70s, but we hadn't really been close to that or affected by it. So when we got to Canada and Windsor, we wanted to explore. And after a while, we got tired of exploring Windsor. We had been to Niagara Falls like 10 times, because every relative who came wanted to go to Niagara Falls. And we started to just look across the river and say, well, let's go there. And so on the weekends, we would go to one of the big shopping malls because there was cooler stores. And then for a while, my brother and I were into model rocketry and remote control cars and weird electronic stuff, of course, from my dad. He may have been into it more than we were at one moment, but suddenly we were all into it. And very quickly, if you got into something a little bit different, a little bit out of the norm, Detroit usually had something more to offer. And so my parents' openness to that really became my openness to Detroit, but also our naivety. We didn't really know how bad, if it was really, how Detroit was. We came up from a pretty white area in England, so we didn't know if there was really racial tensions between Windsor and Detroit, or black and white. We're kind of in our own little world, and we just kind of, again, explored. And that was the same later as I started to go to Detroit by myself. The local record store in Windsor had the new Skinny Puppy or Severed Heads record. But I wanted the old stuff, that, the hard-to-get white label. And so I heard there was record stores in Detroit that were bigger, that had even weirder records. So I went there. I started for a while wearing, secondhand old clothes. There was only one place in Windsor which everyone picked over. But in Detroit, there was these resale shops. There was a whole street full of them. And then later, as I got into music, there was bigger music stores. So Detroit was just there and always had more to offer if you wanted to go there and give it time and explore. For sure, you would find something. And slowly going into music and buying and, finding more of my own identity in Detroit, that brought me into discovering nightclubs and everything else.
I believe you were a fan of a club called The Shelter in Detroit, which is it's not as iconic as the Music Institute. Can you tell me a little bit about The Shelter and the differences between The Shelter and the Music Institute?
Yeah, The Shelter wasn't as iconic, probably because it's still there.
Okay.
As soon as something happens and goes down. But I don't want to belittle the Music Institute, because the Music Institute was a nightclub that existed for about 2 years, that was run and created by Derek May and Dee Win, and basically was the home of Detroit techno while it existed. And we were playing techno, of course, later when I was playing at the Shelter, or people were playing techno at the other nightclubs, but the purity of the music and the experience at the Music Institute was on another level. It was a black, dark room with huge speakers, a strobe light, and music that you'd never heard before. You know, Derek and those guys were playing things that they had never released, probably still haven't released, and it was the first moment where I really felt some type of community. But the funny thing was that I used to go there. I didn't go so often. I didn't find it from the very beginning. I found it towards the tail end, right before it closed. And my brother and I used to go there. And probably we were, out of the 200 or 300 people who were there, we were the only 2 or 3 white kids. And also not only white kids, but white kids from Canada. So I guess we could have felt strange or different, but after feeling so strange coming to Canada and kind of being introverted and not being Canadian but not being in England, in the Music Institute, everybody was there for one purpose. They were there because they didn't just like electronic music. They liked Detroit techno. And they wanted to be there to be surrounded by these frequencies, to close their eyes, actually you couldn't see anybody in there. It was just so dark, and it was just frequencies. And that community, even though we didn't all talk, and I don't remember everybody there, and it's not like I was friends with everybody, it was just, there was a bond or a kinship because of how important that music was to us at that moment in our lives. But it connects to that naivety, you know. Right. I had other friends who were like, you can't go to Detroit. You know, are you crazy? Are you going to go to Detroit at 5 a.m.? You know, the clubs finish at 2, you know, from Canada perspective. No, this club actually gets going at 5, you know. And you know, well, you especially can't go downtown Detroit because you're white. You know, and if anybody else had gone in there, some of my other friends, and walked into a club where they would have been 1 or 2 of the only white kids in there, I don't think they would have been able to handle it. But I honestly, we didn't think about it. It was a bit later when people started asking questions that you're kind of like, okay, I guess, yeah, I can see your perspective, but Matthew and I we were like, that's the place you go if you're into techno. And it was like when we got there, I remember they kind of looked at us and we're like, yeah, we know where we are, you know. We just want to dance. It was really somehow simple and pure.
Obviously, Chicago house, Detroit techno was in its infancy very much African American thing, and I'm wondering how Detroit reacted to these honkies, interlopers on this scene. How were you greeted when you started to make inroads?
There's been a number of phases of my acceptance in or from the Detroit community. I don't even know actually where I sit in that situation right now. Definitely in the beginning, there was a huge, what I felt, acceptance. We'd go down to Derek's place, and there was one corner of Gratiot Avenue where you had Derek's studio, Juan Atkins' studio, Kevin Saunderson's studio. We used to call it Techno Boulevard. So we'd go down there and hang out. Derek would be in the corner, kind of jamming out, you know, downstairs. Mark Kinchin and Carl Craig would be playing around. Juan Atkins and you know, some of the other gang would be making music. It was like, when I think about it now, it was crazy shit that was happening down there. But everybody was like, the community was so small. Like, people, I felt, just were happy that people appreciated the music and what was going on. and I think they were also supportive of when John Acquaviva and I, who was another Canadian who I started recording with, when we started Plus 8. And the first two records, Plus 8 number 1 was John and I, Plus 8 number 2 was myself, John, and a friend, Kenny Larkin, who happened to be African American. He grew up in Detroit. So it was kind of cool. But then on the third record, which was with another friend, Daniel Bell, who was also from Canada, he was also white, we had all actually met downtown Detroit at the Shelter. We were like kids loving techno, worshiping Derek and Kevin. Like Kenny Larkin and I used to drive around the city nearly every night on the highways, going as fast as possible, listening to Jeff Mills on the radio and Derek May, just like little kids. And on record 3, we made a record called Cybersonic Technarchy. It was, let's say, more abrasive, there was some industrial influences there. And on the white labels, we stamped Plus 8, the future sound of Detroit. Which for us, we were like, yeah, we're part of the community. You know, this is our version of where we think Detroit techno is going. So I don't know if it was just the stamp that pissed some people off, or that Cybersonic Technarchy became one of the biggest records of my whole career. It was massive everywhere. And so the future sound of Detroit suddenly was being talked about everywhere. And it was made by 3 kids from Canada who happened to be white. And at that moment, there was a little bit of a shift between the feeling from everybody, well, not everybody, some people in the community. And that's oscillated over the years, you know. We spent a lot of time, I never lived in Detroit, but over 1990 to 96, we spent every weekend in Detroit throwing parties, doing raves from 200 people to 500 to 1,000 to 2,000. And there was also a shift then from the 200 or 300 African Americans or the Black Music Institute to more white kids coming from the suburbs, coming down to Detroit, listening to all types of Detroit techno music and enjoying it. And not everybody appreciated that shift. Like now in retrospect, I can understand. But we were so, again, I feel that we were just naive and so excited that we were somehow making records and trying to live up to the expectations of Derek, Kevin, and Juan, to make records that maybe they would like, that maybe they would play. That's all we wanted at that moment. We wanted to get in the car and drive through Detroit with Kenny Larkin and listen to Jeff or Derek play and maybe play one of our records. We probably would have wet our pants. I don't think it ever happened. But that was our goal.
I mean, on a personal relationship basis, did it alter, you know, the future sound of Detroit thing, did it alter anything with the people that you did actually know in Detroit? And
no,
was there any jealousy, or were they cool with it?
No, I think any animosity or weirdness came more from people we didn't really know. Not that they weren't important in the Detroit scene at that moment. We just didn't. We had certain connections, and most of those people, I think, understood we were just excitable kids trying to do our thing. And I didn't feel that it ever really got out of hand. I think, I think in a way, I think it was, it's so hard, like, when you think back at moments, there was times when we nearly all came together. You know, in the early Plus 8 days, there was another huge label, still huge, from Detroit, Underground Resistance. And to the outside world, it was like Mike from Underground Resistance would say it was like sonic warfare. They would fire a record and then we would fire one back, always trying to do a better one. So it was healthy competition. But it wasn't like that behind the scenes. It was more healthy competition and kind of fun and games. And at one point, we all wanted to actually take control of our vinyl pressing and things. And we nearly, at one point, +8, KMS, and Underground Resistance were about that close to buying a pressing plant altogether. You know, and it was really about some financing issues, getting the money together, that it didn't happen, rather than jealousy or any cultural problems. You know, at the heart, the community of Detroit and techno music is a DIY culture. People, you know, feel that they have something they want to say, a voice. They want to take control. They've used technology to unleash their creativity, and they kind of want to do it themselves or with a tight community. So as you have Transmat record label or Metroplex or +8 or Underground Resistance, of course we're our own little entities, but somehow you're also tied together, because there is, in my mind, some kind of unified mission of using technology to unlock your creativity.
When you switch on your machines in the studio and go to make music, what do you do? What's the first thing you do, or how do you approach music making? What's the creative?
I think creating music is very spontaneous for me. Like I said about DJing, there isn't much planning or preparation, except to make sure all the machines are working. And then it's doodling and playing with machines to get something that feels right for that moment. A certain day you walk in and you just feel like working with a certain machine or testing a new plugin. So it's very much exploring and finding some type of rhythm or some type of sound that feels special and exciting, and then following that, hopefully, to a conclusion. There's not always a conclusion, but you know, I write down a lot of ideas, but I don't necessarily go in with a melody in my head. Well, I don't think I have many melodies in my music either, but it is. I think it is about, for me, exploring and discovering new sounds and rhythms. And rhythm is probably maybe the most important thing for me. Quite often I start with a drum rhythm and I work from there. And
is that process swift? I noticed the Avalanches have just released their first album since 2001. You're obviously a lot more productive than that. Is it easy to make decisions?
Yeah, I believe making music should be at least as quick as possible. Doesn't mean, I think there's a lot of preparation work in knowing your machines and knowing the instruments and the sequencers, so that when you feel you have something that you want to do, that you can get it out, that you can, sit there and it works. But when it actually comes, it's usually quite fast and usually quite fun, and it's really like jamming with your favorite friends. I don't like to sit too much after I finish the track or in a computer screen planning everything out and arranging and thinking, okay, this should come now, then the next piece, and now drop out. I try to do all that live as my tape machine or as my computer is recording, and just go by what feels right at that moment. Much like when I'm DJing, I know I have these records, and suddenly I'm playing and I'm like, okay, that record makes sense right now. But 5 minutes ago, I wouldn't have maybe even thought about that record. And it's somehow the same in the studio.
So I'd like to thank Richie, and I'm sure you'll all give him a huge round of applause for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.